I'm Gavin Blair, a freelance journalist from the UK. Today I'm going to talk about Brexit, Great Britain's decision to leave the European Union. First, I'd like to talk about the background to the referendum that decision came about from. So, the word Brexit, to start with, is what's known as a portmanteau, a combination of two words, Britain and exit. It came from the original word of Grexit, which was the talk of Greece leaving the European Union after the financial crisis there. Now, background to this. The United Kingdom joined the EU in 1973, and there was actually a referendum in 1975 held by the Labour government then, whether Britain would continue membership of the European Union. That was actually the first national referendum ever held in the UK, and at that time there was fairly strong support for maintaining membership. The vote was in fact 67% to 33%, so a 2-to-1 majority in favour. The turnout in the referendum actually wasn't that high, suggesting that feelings were running certainly not as strongly as they ran in 2016. Now, after that, opposition to the European Union did grow in the UK through the 70s, 80s and 90s, and came from different sides of the political spectrum at different times. So during the 80s, the opposition was mainly from the left, the Labour Party, though not exclusively. And then into the 90s, the opposition came more from the right, the Conservative Party. And then eventually there was a party formed specifically with the aim of leaving the European Union, the United Kingdom Independence Party, which came to be known as UKIP, and was indeed pivotal in the 2016 referendum here. It has to be said that Britain was perhaps always a less than fully enthusiastic European nation. We never joined the euro currency when that was launched in 2002, held onto the pound. And we never joined the so-called Schengen area, which allowed people to move without passports throughout Europe. There are perhaps cultural reasons for this. And in some ways there are parallels with Japan and its relationship with Asia. Britain is an island nation and in some ways regards itself as separate from Europe, in a similar way that Japan somehow considered itself separate from Asia. This anti-European sentiment was stoked then over the years by a series of stories run in the media about European regulations supposedly to control the British and the people. Many of these stories were in fact not true, but they ran in the media and people believed them. There was a story that ran in most of the national newspapers that the European Union was stipulating the curvature, how bendy bananas could be. This was in fact a complete fabrication. There was no such rule, but that was repeated during the 2016 referendum by the then Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson. Then eventually in the 2015 general election, the then Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron promised in the manifesto that they would indeed hold a referendum whether or not Britain should stay or leave the EU. Their referendum campaign was long and certainly passionate. Interesting, both party leaders, Cameron, the Prime Minister, and Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, the main opposition, were both Remainers, as the people who wanted to stay in the European Union came to be known. But it has to be said they were less than passionate Remainers. Mr Corbyn was in fact a long-time Eurosceptic, meaning he wasn't particularly for the EU, and his campaigning perhaps reflected that. The Conservative Party was officially neutral, meaning that members of Parliament from the party could campaign for or against. And the truth is, all across the political spectrum, there were members of Parliament who were for and against from the various parties. The Remain campaign was really quite complacent and perhaps lacklustre. Many people believed, both in the political establishment and the media, that the result was a sure thing, that Britain would stay in the EU. The Leave campaign was far more passionate. They tapped into fears about control of the country, let's take our country back, let's take control of our country back was one of the slogans. There were other fears about living standards. Living standards had dropped since the global financial crisis, and people at the lower end of the economic scale had suffered the worst of that. There were very real grievances there. Immigration was another issue. Britain has always been has long been a multicultural society, and there have been waves and waves of immigrants that have come in. And there was certainly some resentment there. That was certainly stoked by particularly UKIP, but the Leave campaigners in general. There were a number of controversies during this campaign. Now, during any political campaign, there were always arguments, controversies about facts and opinions, but this were particularly intense during the Brexit campaign. There were bold and dramatic claims made on both sides of what would happen if we didn't or did leave, and the arguments really raged. The immigration issue was a big one, and it was portrayed some ways as an issue of racism, but I think that's oversimplistic. It was more complex than that. And in fact, many people in the UK who were themselves immigrants or the children of immigrants were actually opposed to more immigration. So it wasn't simply a question of race. People were concerned about the numbers of people coming into the country and the pressure that might put on services, even though people also realised that immigrants, of course, also supported the economy, did a lot of jobs that other people didn't want to do, and paid their taxes and contributed. UKIP certainly played heavily on that. There were also concerns about economic inequality and the so-called policies of austerity. This was cuts to public services and spending that were introduced after the global financial crisis of 2008 and 2009, and they certainly had an impact on a lot of lives. In some ways, the EU and Europe itself was used as a scapegoat for that. Look at the problems you're having. The problem is the EU. The problem is the immigrants. The reality was, of course, more complex, but it was easy to push that. As the referendum got nearer, the country was really, truly divided, deeply divided, to an extent far greater than in a normal election campaign. And the country was really divided along lines of geography, age, race, class, and education. So different parts of the country had completely different opinions. London, the London metropolitan area, was heavily Remain. It's a cosmopolitan area. It's also the most wealthy area of the country, of course, and it came out firmly Remain. The rest of the southeast around was very strongly Leave. The former industrial areas of the Midlands, the north, which had suffered as factories, shipyards had closed, manufacturing industry had declined, those areas were firmly Leave. Age was a far greater determiner of whether people were Leave or Remain than happened in the usual political campaigns. There was a huge generational gap. A large majority of the under 25s were Remain, and the over 60s, over 65s were hugely Leave. A very stark divide. White Britain voted a majority to Leave, whereas black and Asian Britons voted to a larger extent, actually, with a larger majority to stay. Class and education. Essentially, the more educated people were, the more likely they were to vote Remain. And there are obvious explanations in that. As I touched earlier, people at the lower end of the socioeconomic scale had suffered more from globalization. Jobs had gone overseas. They felt that their lives and their livelihoods were more threatened by globalization, by immigration, and therefore they were more against this. The perhaps iconic image of the whole campaign was the big red bus. There was a big red bus used by the Leave campaign, and written on the side was the slogan, "We send £350 million a week to the EU. Let's fund our NHS instead." The NHS is the National Health Service, the free National Health Service of Britain. And the argument was that this money we were sending to Europe could in fact be better spent at home. This was clearly a vast oversimplification, to put it diplomatically. Many people would point out that it was completely untrue. And in fact, the day after the referendum, when the results had come in, the leaders of the Leave campaign were already backtracking and admitting that £350 million a week was not going to be going to the National Health Service.